Welcome to Grace Gospel Fellowship Sunday Morning Bible Study. I'm John Kirkwood, and this is the church where we, His people, seek to honor in God we trust. We do so this morning from the 15th chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Peace like a river, joy like a fountain, love like an ocean. We sang about water this morning, so I think I'm going to begin in the water, walking on water. You might have seen in the news, and this was the first I found out about it, but you might have seen in the news a few weeks ago, there were hundreds of people walking out onto Lake Michigan from the Michigan side, Little Traverse Bay. And they were walking out onto the ice about 1,200 feet offshore. There was a tent set up, and in that tent there was a hole bored through about 5 feet of ice. And I guess this used to be an annual event, but because of bad weather and thin ice, they haven't done it in 4 years. But hundreds of people were lining up and standing in line in the frigid cold to spend a few seconds above a hole in Lake Michigan, looking down at a crucifix, at a statue of Jesus Christ. It's not the one you see on the screen. That one's in Florida. But it's a fascinating story. It's supposed to be the only icon of Christ submerged in fresh water. I don't know if that's true or not, maybe just the only known one. But in the 50s, a family lost a child, and they ordered this crucifix from Italy in what today would cost about $23,000. It was no cheap endeavor, and it was carved and sent, and on the way it got damaged. One of the arms broke off, so they didn't accept delivery. And a local diving group got it on the cheap, and they submerged it in Lake Michigan in memory of one of their comrades who had died in a dive in a nearby lake, and it's been there ever since. But this is the first year I saw a bunch of people standing in line waiting to get a glimpse of it, and I thought to myself, well, you might get a few seconds before they urge you to part, so everyone during the daylight hours gets an opportunity to look through that hole. I guess if you're not a scuba diver, that's the only chance you get to see this Christ in Lake Michigan. And in Florida, there's also one. In the ocean, there's a couple of them. The most famous one is off the shores of Italy, but in Florida they have one, and if you know Shane Morris, he wrote about it recently. He recently was down there vacationing with his wife, and he did a snorkeling excursion in Florida, and he saw the one that is submerged off of the Florida coast, and I want to share with you some of his insights today about that. He writes this. This is actually from April 1st. He writes, at John Pennekamp State Park in Florida, just east of Key Largo, you'll find a stretch of what is probably the continental United States' best coral reef. Not much of a contest. There's only 2 living coral reefs in the lower 48, that is. One of the most spectacular sections of that reef, which I snorkeled with my wife and little brother last week, is called Dry Rocks. Swaying gorgonians, sea fans, brain, fire, and mustard corals of all colors and sizes pack the rocks about 15 feet below the turquoise waves. Fish in colors you hardly knew existed teem like flocks of tropical birds. It's beautiful in a way that's difficult for words to convey. It's worship-inducing. Yet virtually everyone who books snorkel, scuba, or glass-bottom boat tours with the state park wants to see something else and seemingly more mundane, a statue of Jesus. Some years ago, a philanthropist donated the 4,000-pound, 8.5-foot bronze sculpture called Christ of the Abyss, which is a replica of Guido Galletti's original, sunk in the Mediterranean, as a memorial to lost sailors. The Floridian version stands submerged in 25 feet of water, arms spread skyward, surrounded by a natural amphitheater of coral, and seemingly everyone who visits the state park wants to swim with him. Photo ops are photo ops. Everyone who visits Pisa needs to get that goofy picture pretending to hold up the Leaning Tower. But a marine sanctuary that includes 70 nautical square miles of jaw-dropping natural wonders and countless shipwrecks, it's odd how popular Christ of the Abyss is. It's just a statue, a religious statue. You'd think the unbelieving visitors, especially those convinced of nature's unaided power to generate the reef's splendor, and even their sense of wonder itself from amino acids, would spend their time elsewhere. But Joseph's boy remains far and away the most popular underwater resident at John Pennekamp. I'm going to skip a little bit so I don't have to read the whole thing to you. But he says, he's talking about how people who are not really devoutly Christian still want to connect themselves to the person of Christ, including even politicians who really care nothing of Christ, but they'll sprinkle a campaign speech with a verse or mention Jesus just to connect with his followers. He says this at the end of that section. He says, why do legislators who've abandoned all pretense of holding a Christian cosmology still try to appropriate this Galilean's name to legitimize their policy proposals? What is it about Jesus that continues to evoke moral authority and inspire near universal reverence as a symbol? Find out the answer to that, and you might just understand what's motivating city officials in Vladivostok, Russia. This is fascinating. City officials in Vladivostok, Russia, to lay plans for a colossal 223-foot statue of the Son of Man. It will stand on a hill once reserved for the likeness of Vladimir Lenin. Amen? The undertones of Russian nationalism are obvious in the announcement, but we shouldn't miss the fact that it is Jesus of Nazareth, not the communist luminary whose waxen corpse still lies in Moscow, and not the current president of Russia, but Jesus of Nazareth who will bless the shores of the Pacific. As at John Pennekamp, the draw of the God-man is uncanny. Even those who have no real allegiance to the Christian gospel or to a Christian church long to appropriate Christ's image and reputation. And no wonder, as James Allen Francis famously wrote in 1926, all the armies that ever marched, and all the governments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned have not affected life upon this earth as powerfully as that one solitary life. 2,000 years after Jesus spoke his last public word on earth, many of the most influential human beings alive seem to understand that their only shot at immortality is hitching their name to his. So there he stands, the new Adam in his underwater Eden, upstaging the glories of the first creation with open arms, welcoming all comers into the second creation. Even the tourists seem to know who he is, and the most beautiful reef fish flock to his monument in unusual numbers, and he puts in quotations. I'm not kidding, nor am I trying to sound superstitious. The sight of creation exalting this man, despite itself, irresistibly recalls the throne room scenes in Revelation 4 and 7, in which unnumbered multitudes of souls and creatures, both seen and unseen, worship the Lamb. Because, of course, he's not just God. The blazing color of the reef, the skill of a sculptor, and the naked hills of Vladivostok at sunrise already proclaim the glory of their Creator without further adornment. How would you depict an invisible God, after all, even if you wanted to? No, Christ is more. He is man, the man, human in the way we all long to be and were meant to be and will be when we see him as he is. For the Lord of the coral is not merely its maker, infinitely transcending it in uncreated light and impenetrable darkness. He has become forever part of the same creation by virtue of his manhood. The true king of all the majesty of the deep, encrusted with a rainbow of invertebrates and content to be so. We swim out to see a sculpture of him above all other sights because he is here, because he is one of us, and because even unbelievers intuit that there is nothing more beautiful in all of creation than the God who chose to submerge himself in it. That's Shane Morris. So 600 souls walked on water in Michigan because of that man. And yes, it was frozen water, but it is a fascinating thing to think about. I think recently I wrote about apologetics and evangelism, and we should never separate the two, by the way. I think we've gotten into murky water when we see those as two different paragraphs of a systematic theology. Evangelism and apologetics are twins. They go together. One is cause and one is effect. And the reason we use apologetics is to get us to evangelism. It's the mistake, by the way, dispensationalists has made with dispensationalism. They've created an idol of it, and they forgot the proper use of it. My father used to say, and I love this, he used to say, well, I teach the dispensations to point to the grace of God. And you can't disconnect the two. There's a reason for these two things. But people walking on water in Michigan just to look at a statue, I know some people might find that, especially if you come from a Reformed background, a little bit eerie or superstitious or maybe even creepy. I love it. I even love the oil stains that depict Mary that people gather around to see. Because to me, the stones are crying out. To me, that is actually a fulfillment of little Mary's prophecy. And so I don't mind it at all. I think it becomes strange if you start to worship an icon or something like that, and it becomes a little strange there. But I want to talk to you about that because Shane brought out very well this idea that Jesus is man. Jesus is man. So I almost called today the famous words of Pontius Pilate, Ecce Homo, behold the man. I actually think in this Easter season, if I could use an Assyrian reference to it, I actually think in this Passover season, in this resurrection season, we should listen to Pontius Pilate. We actually should behold the man. And in discussing evangelism and apologetics recently, I said that I think the biggest mistake that young apologists make and that apologetic courses and seminars make is that we focus on overtly too much on only one leg of the three legs of the stool. So There's 3 legs on your apologetics evangelism stool, and for you to remember it, you could remember the word ICE, I-C-E, but I'm going to use ICD just because I don't like E for execution. I like D for delivery. But ICE means intent, content, and delivery. Intent, content, and execution. I like delivery. So I'm going to do ICD. But if you want to remember it easily, it's intent, content, and delivery. 90% of the time in an apologetics conference, in an apologetics book, in an apologetics seminar, in apologetics YouTube videos, 90% of it is spent on content, getting the information right. It's very important to have the right information. Although when an enormous amount of time is spent on content, then intent and delivery are barely mentioned at all. And we don't live in a classical world like even C.S. Lewis did growing up with a tutor like the Kirk who taught us the trivium, right? We haven't grown up with the classical education, so we know that we first learn grammar, and grammar leads to logic, and logic leads to rhetoric. We don't know all that by default with our public education, so we struggle with intent and delivery. And we get into arguments, and we create more heat than light because we can't handle it if somebody doesn't see our point or disagrees with us. And so I would like to suggest, if you're going into apologetics or evangelism, or if you eventually teach a course like that, that you take the time to develop the I and the E. Content's important, but it's not critical. Why do I say that? Because Paul said that. Because Paul, in 1 Corinthians 13, said you could have 100% knowledge of the sea, of the one leg of the stool, and be cacophony, be a clanging cymbal without love. And it's love that directs your intent in the conversation and your delivery. So what is your intent? If your intent is to win an argument, you are shaming God. If your intent is to win an argument or to impress somebody with what you know or whatever, or to shame somebody else, it doesn't matter if your content is spot on. As a matter of fact, it's worse because you're bringing shame to the name that you've taken in vain. I sound like Jesse Jackson. I didn't mean that. Shame to the name you've taken in vain. Lord, forgive me. Intent is crucial. What is your intent when you're talking to somebody about the Lord? And you should pray about that. I like to think the intent should be that same passion that our Lord had for the lost sheep or the lost son. You can look at it this way. My brother-in-law Gordy shared this wonderful video recently, and I don't know the man's name. I think he was a country music personality or something, but he brought his mother on stage. He wrote a song to her because she's suffering in Alzheimer's, and she doesn't know her son. And he wrote this lovely song, and he's holding his mom as he's singing it on stage. And it was just so beautiful. And as I was witnessing it for the first time, I thought to myself, this is exactly how the Christian should treat the unbeliever. How this young man was treating his incapacitated mother. This is exactly the kind of intent we should have with the lost, because they've been blinded by the god of this world, and they're enslaved. And they've come upon us, maybe their one opportunity for freedom, and we should have nothing but pity on this person. Nothing but gentle pity. So intent and delivery. Delivery is persuasion. It's very important. This is where you could really hone your craft. Jesus Christ was a great persuader. He used storytelling to aid in that, and the surgical placement of questions. There's a wonderful book about Jesus and questions, and I think here's another place you can tell that evangelists and apologists have it all wrong. This is an easy way to tell. Are they full of answers? Now, I'm not picking on Hank Hanegraaff, but I've always hated the name of his show, The Bible Answer Man. And one of these days, when I have enough time, I'm going to be the Bible Question Man, right? Jesus Christ was asked over 100 and some questions, just what we have in the Gospels. And I can't remember the exact number. I think it was 181, but it's a shot in the dark. Guess how many he answered? 180 some questions. Guess how many he answered? If you haven't read the book or counted in the Gospels, you wouldn't know. 3. But he asked 303 questions. Now, if in our ministry and in our witness and in our testimony, we never ask a question, we're not following Jesus. We might be following, I don't know, who's your favorite apologist? Frank Turek, William Lane Craig. Hopefully it's not Ray Discomfort, but whoever you're following, are they full of answers? That's very off-putting to the world, by the way, too. Very off-putting to the. One of the things that you'll notice by watching Jordan Peterson is he's thoughtful. He actually thinks about the questions he's asked. And that shows respect, by the way, and it shows he's listening. Oh, I don't want to get distracted because I'm not doing an apologetics class today. How did I get on that? Somebody help me. What are we talking about here? Delivery. Peace. Yeah, how did I get there, though? We were in Lake Michigan. The
impact of Jesus.
The impact, yes, the man. Okay, thank you. You brought me back to Jesus, the man. The man. One of your greatest opportunities, and it's the easiest opportunity, especially if you're given to asking questions, you don't have to have any of the answers for your friends. You could just ask surgical questions that make them think, yeah, that's pretty interesting. You see those 600 nutters standing on the frozen lake the other day in the frigid winter to see a statue of a dead carpenter's son? That doesn't boggle your mind? If Jesus is myth, which is what some people in the world would like you to believe, Newsweek, Time Magazine, the critics, the skeptics, the cynics, okay, let's play along. Let's just play along a little bit. My father was born in 1930. In 1931, it wasn't the first, but it's the most famous and long-running, but 1931, the New York Times started to publish its bestseller list. 1931. I think it was 5 nonfiction books and 4 fiction books at the time. It's run ever since from 1931 forward. They give a New York Times bestseller list, and granted, it's referencing America, but you know, we buy, write, and sell the most books in the world. And I just love to say this because so many people are shocked to hear it, but it's been wrong every year since 1931. It's never gotten it right since 1931 because it hasn't listed the Bible as the #1 bestseller. It has to exclude Bible sales to have a list that anyone will read because it will lack any sense of drama if every week they put the Holy Bible at #1. Well, but it's true. Now, not only is it true, and not only is it a bestseller in America, it's a worldwide bestseller, but I want you to think about it for a second. This statue that's in Lake Michigan of this guy, Pontius Pilate. Yeah, all you had to say was Pontius Pilate, and I would have remembered y'all. But I think we should listen to Pilate. and Pilate's wife. But Pilate said, behold the man. So let's just behold the man. Forget the God stuff. Forget the God stuff for a second. Let's just behold the man and see how the myth blossomed. Just behold the man. Behold him now. Or behold him then. But we've seen some incredible things. New York Times, I mentioned the bestseller list, has never gotten it right. Now, I'm just talking about this book. Now, when I'm talking to Jewish friends, and I try and present Christ, I come at it different ways. I try and be a little bit clever. I try with my intent and my delivery to at least spark curiosity in them. And I start by saying, you know, when this was half the size, when this was just the Hebrew Scriptures, no one knew about it. Outside of the Israeli priesthood, no one knew about it. 0 people knew about the Hebrew Scriptures outside of the Aaronic priesthood. Now, some visitors 3 times a year would go to Jerusalem, and we had North Africa, right? Ethiopia, because of Solomon's dalliance with the Queen of Sheba and elsewhere. But nobody had the scrolls. They weren't in the end table of every hotel in the, known world. But one of the things that those scriptures say, those scriptures that no one ever heard of or ever read, one of those things that those scriptures say about the Messiah is that when he comes, the people in this half are going to reject him. He's going to come to his own people, and they're going to say, no farther. They're going to reject him. They're going to despise him. Did Jesus the man fulfill that? I don't know. Something to think about. The other thing to think about is it says that the world, while Israel rejects its Messiah, is going to embrace him. Well, now we can talk about this book. Jesus is the one Jew in the world who made this book a bestseller. Well, now you might say, well, wait a minute. He didn't write it. Okay. All right, I grant you that. A bunch of Jews wrote it, right? With the exception of maybe one Greek. A bunch of Jews wrote it, one doctor. But they wrote it about somebody. They wrote it about the one celebrity in the book. They believed that he was the Jewish Messiah. They fill out the end of this book, about that much, with stories about him. And now this book goes from obscurity to worldwide bestseller every year. Dominant. More dominant than the New England Patriots, more dominant than Michael Jordan, more dominant than Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones put together. But it's not only this book, because every year there are thousands of other books written about the man Jesus Christ. Is he real? Is he not real? Did he say it? Did he not say it? Did he fulfill it? Is it a myth? Good, bad, indifferent, people are writing about Jesus. And we're coming up into that time of the year where we have these wonderful opportunities. Yeah, Christmas and Easter. But we have these wonderful opportunities to place these surgically placed questions in the minds of our friends and our neighbors and maybe even some enemies about the man, Jesus Christ. And I love that Shane refers to him as the Galilean, because he is the lowly Galilean. He is the Nazarene, Jesus of Nazareth. It's not Mount Olympus. He had an address. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to dispute the fact that the Son of Man didn't have a roof. I'm not saying he had an exact address to a home, but he came on a particular date on the calendar. There were GPS coordinates that bound his life and ministry to a particular area on the globe. He is Jesus of Nazareth. He is the lowly Galilean. And you say, how has he transformed history? Well, I'll tell you, that's one compelling myth. And if I'm an unbeliever, it's remarkable. I've got to be at least a little bit curious about it. When my favorite athlete sinks a three-point basket to win, and the first thing he says in an interview is, I want to thank my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. If he's only talking about a dead carpenter, that's weird. Now, I've seen men dedicate athletic prowess to their father who had just passed away. Have you ever seen that? Some of the most gripping, I think, speeches at a Hall of Fame induction is when an athlete remembers his mom or dad who couldn't be here today. And he says something like, I hope they're watching for heaven or something, but Mom inspired me because she was amazing and all this is for her. That makes sense. We all get that. Somebody who loves their mom or dad, but a dead carpenter from 2,000 years ago, that's some myth. I don't know. Can you think of some questions you can ask about that? I think I was telling you about my Jewish friends, and I try and come in the back door sometimes with them. But the Bible is a perfect opportunity to bring it up. I mean, no one can dispute it. There's a lot of things you can dispute. There's a lot of things that we say are fulfilled prophecy that a skeptic could say, eh. And then there are those things that they can't dispute. There are those prophecies that are indisputable. You can't dispute them. The most severe hostile critic can't dismiss it because it's obvious. And one of the obvious things to my Jewish friends is no one ever heard of Lamentations prior to the wake of Jesus Christ. Andy Stanley likes to say, something happened in the first century. Something amazing happened in the first century that spurred a flurry of writing. Right? So even this idea that these guys started to write about this myth. All right. You have people from all over an area writing about a guy. Some of it is respected and revered over generations and included in what we call the Bible. And a lot of it is looked at and said, this is really kind of crazy. It's not inspired. We're not going to accept it, but it's still there. I mean, have you read the Gospel of Peter? The Gospel of Peter is great. It's like something Stan Lee would have wrote, right? The Gospel of Peter has Jesus coming out of the tomb, but he's 90 feet tall. And then following him is a cross. The cross actually comes out after Jesus, and guess what? It talks. It's like a Veggie Tale, right? So yeah, that one didn't make the cut. But even that, even the Gospel of Peter, it doesn't undermine the person of Jesus Christ and the story of the Christ. It shows that there was discernment in the early church, and they realized this is rubbish. So what do you do with this? What do you do with all this? Well, the Jewish scripture says he would be rejected by his own, but embraced by the world. Has that happened? It's happening in Little Traverse Bay, in the Mediterranean. It's happening on a coral reef outside of Florida. It's happening in Vladivostok, Russia. It's happening in thousands and thousands, 350,000 different buildings today, just in America alone, where people are sitting where you're sitting and listening to somebody like me on a stage talk about this dead carpenter, behold the man. This Nazarene, this lowly Galilean. Well, it's got to pique your curiosity a little bit. Now, a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, I gave you 2 other things. And I encourage you during this time, whether you observe Lent, I do not, but I see it as an opportunity to witness to those who do. And a lot of people have traditions during Lent. They give up this or they take up this. And one of C.S. Lewis's traditions was to read, well, it's actually a radio play that Dorothy Sayers wrote called Man Born to be King. It was very controversial at the time because she updated the language and people were freaking out that she didn't use the King James language in a play on the BBC radio. But Lewis would read it every year before Easter, on the way up to Easter. And he wrote her privately, and he said that other than one other work, he never cried over and over at the reading of something as he did with The Man Born to be King. But so I don't know if you have a tradition or if you have something, or maybe there's something you read. In Kirkwood family, we watch The Passion of the Christ. We watch different things leading up to Easter. But our minds should be marinated in strategic questions that we can ask our friends and neighbors who still are blind and enslaved and do not see. And there are great, great opportunities here. I'm going to mention a few in a second along those lines, but I'll give you a couple of others. Now, there are more than these, but there are a couple of others, indisputable things that no one can reject. And I mentioned Mary. We mentioned Mary, right? Mary brags in the Magnificat that Christ was a lowly Galilean. She was really low, right? This little handmaiden, this little teenage girl, bragged that every generation would call her blessed from this time forward. Well, has that happened? You don't have to answer it. You just have to say, I mean, do people know the name of Jesus' mom? Do they celebrate it rightly or wrongly? Has it been true? That's it, just leave it. Leave it right there and let them think about it. I mean, after all, he was a carpenter, right? You know any carpenters? You might know a few carpenters. You know their mom's name? Yeah. All right. I won't pursue that too far. Another great example, though, I've mentioned that's pretty much indisputable is especially with Jewish friends, is the advice of Gamaliel in Acts 5. The disciples are brought before the Sanhedrin. They're going to kill them. I mean, this moment, Acts 5, by the way, if you've seen it before in the Bible. By the way, it's when Joseph's brothers were going to kill him, and one guy talks him out of it. I mean, this is it actually is quite coincidental, but Gamaliel plays the role of Judah there in a sense, because Gamaliel talks him out of killing the disciples. And what does he do? He says, wait a minute, and he brings up 2 current events. He goes, you guys all know Judah and Theudas. They claimed to be the Messiah too, just like this Jesus guy. And they had hundreds of followers too. And they were controversial. And then what happened? They died. And what happened to their followers? They went on to something else. They went on to some other conspiracy. They drifted away. Those guys were tumbleweed. And he says this, he says, look, Jesus will be tumbleweed too, if he's not of God. If he's not of God, he'll be just like Judas and Theudas. No one will know his name in a few hours. But if he is of God, you risk the gravity of being in a position where you're actually fighting against God, not the better part of wisdom. And what? He persuaded them. These murderers. He persuaded them, so they just, they beat beat the living daylights out of them and released them, but they didn't kill him. Well, was Mary right? Was Gamaliel right? Was Jesus forgotten in a few months? Now, you might have a really good argument for why Jesus has been embraced worldwide. Maybe it was an appealing argument to make to a slave, a world of slavery. You know, what, in Greece, a third of the people were slaves. In Rome, it was 2/3. So Jesus comes into this world where every 2 people you see on the street out of 3 is a slave. And this genius, Paul, has the gall to say that in Christianity, there's no free and no slave. We're one in Christ. Would that appeal to slaves? Yeah, that would be appealing to me, because in the Roman world, I was nothing. Maybe that's what led to so many followers so early on. And you know what? That's a great argument. That's really a strong argument. Has a couple of dings in it, especially around 66 when Rome burns. You know, when Rome burns to the ground, and all of a sudden being a Christian wasn't just a cool hobby like getting an earring. Now everyone with that earring got put to death in gruesome ways, right? So it might have had a ding or so there during the reign of Nero and Aurelius and others that had a systematic attack on everything Christian. As a matter of fact, it was a rough world to live in until about the 4th century. So for the first 300 years, wasn't going to be a marketing campaign that multiplied followers, because you were exposed to the power and the might and the cruelty and the brutality of the Roman Empire. Well, we live in a world here now, 2019. And it's a world that has been shaped by a man who's been dead for thousands of years. Oh, we're just considering the man. Some people thought they saw him, would argue there's an empty tomb. Okay, we don't know that. What do we know? What do we know, and what does that tell you? You want to just use common sense? Well, there are some things we know. We know that this is really popular. And books about this are really, they fill shelves. And you go into the world's art museums, and you see the inspiration for the greatest artist this world have ever seen was, again, this guy. And the songs you sang this morning. So in song, in pen, in artist's brush, all these things are important, but they aren't the most important. I think the most important tool we have, we rarely pull out of our quiver. Oh, Sam's getting in trouble now because I just saw him sitting in the back. You thought you'd get out of my vision by sitting that far back, Sam. Sam, on a Thursday night, quoted an atheist for us, and it's just a wonderful quote. And we were talking, again, about evangelism and apologetics, and how some skeptics are just so dug in that no matter what you show them, right? You could talk about Mary, the fulfillment of Mary's prophecy. You could talk about, the popularity of the Bible, all these different things. And even if you had a YouTube video of Christ rising from the dead, right? Or even if somehow, the stars spelled out, I rose from the dead, believe in me. They wouldn't believe. You know, these are guys who wouldn't believe. And Sam mentioned that there was this atheist who said, you know, there's nothing in the Bible that I can't poke holes in. There's nothing in the Bible that I can't refute. The one thing I can't refute is the life of my mother. His mother was a devout believer. And the one stone in this atheist shoe, it wasn't content. It wasn't information. It was his mother and the love that was haunting the doubt he had about his own faith, the unfaith. The one thing he couldn't refute was the life of his mother. And I think sometimes we don't pull that arrow out because we don't think it's going to be as strong as the Kalam cosmological argument. No, it is. The influence of a person or the transformation of a person does move the dial. It does persuade. We're sitting on the second weekend now of a film called Unplanned. Have you heard about it? Yeah. So Abby Johnson is one of my favorite people in the pro-life movement. And years ago, Wendy and I were talking about this. Years ago, in my pro-life circles, I recommended that we should devote ourselves completely to those who've come into the pro-life movement from a far country. Because those are people that will have voices that the world will listen to, not just our corner of the room. And so Bernard Nathanson, right? Bernard Nathanson, if you don't know him, was a doctor, famous doctor. He was the co-founder of NARAL. He had done himself thousands of abortions, tens of thousands. I think it was over 70,000 abortions. Bernard Nathanson, the first 2 abortions he did were his own children. And then one day, as technology would have it, technology grows, he says to a friend of his who was an ultrasound guy, bring the ultrasound and we'll do an abortion with the ultrasound. And Bernard Nathanson witnesses what has been hidden from him, even though he was an abortion doctor. He witnesses it. He sees it for the first time. You can too. I've got it on my shelf. I've never opened it. I can't do it. He filmed it. And the film, The Silent Scream, was that abortion. The first abortion done with an ultrasound. Well, Bernard Nathanson was crushed when he actually saw what he did, and he famed the famous phrase, if wombs had windows on it, abortion would end tomorrow. Bernard Nathanson, a nominal Jewish atheist, ends up trusting Christ, baptized into a Catholic church. Chuck Colson was present at his baptism. And he becomes a staunch critic of abortion and a thoroughly reliable and powerful voice for life, because he was the co-founder of NARAL, and now he's speaking for life, Bernard Nathanson. And then you have Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe herself. A similar story with Norma McCorvey, right? She's just smoking a cigarette. She works at a Dallas abortion clinic, and like smokers are, you know, you see them in about 10 minutes outside. But smokers have to have a smoke every now and then. So she worked in a Dallas abortion clinic. She'd come out, she'd smoke. There were protesters there. Among them was Flip Benham, the Baptist pastor, whose sons are now famous, the Benham brothers. And there was a family from Flip's church. It was a mother with 2 children, and one of them was 7 or 8 years old. I think was her name Emily? I always forget her name, poor thing. I think her name was Emily. And they were out there, and you know, somehow Norma got to know Emily and her mom and Flip, and they'd talk occasionally, friendly. And on this one occasion, Norma's sitting on a bench, and she's having her cigarette. She's sitting, and Emily's next to her. I think it's Emily. Forgive me if it's not. And she's smoking, and they're talking just about life. And Norma is talking about her teenagers. Because, you know, Norma never got an abortion. Did you know that? By the time her case was heard by the Supreme Court, she'd given birth already. So she never got an abortion, even though she was for abortion. She was the leading figure in Roe v. Wade. She's having a cigarette, and she's talking about her daughter, I believe it was. And little Emily's confused, and she looks up at her, and she said, "But Norma, if you love kids so much, why do you kill them in there?" Now, Norma McCorvey relates in her story, she says, "If that wasn't a child who said it to me, I would have spit on them and cursed them out. But because it was her, my dear little friend, it resonated in me. And then a few weeks later, walking past the park in my neighborhood, I saw no one was at the park. And I said, my God, what have I done?" Norma McCorvey becomes one of these staunch voices for life. Now, Abby Johnson, similar to Norma McCorvey, working in one of the biggest clinics in Texas. Similar to Bernard Nathanson, they're shorthanded one day. She normally works in the front, shuffling papers. She's the head of the clinic. She never gets into the rooms where the dirty deed is actually done. And a doctor needs help with an ultrasound abortion. And she comes in to aid the doctor, and she sees what takes place. And she runs, a little bit later, she runs out of the clinic crying. And there's different groups out there. Now, you know I've been very harsh with AHA. The AHA people are Protestant, anti-Catholic. Most of them are like Westboro Baptists, and they're the ones who shout nasty things. You know them. They protest at our church because I'm not pro-life enough. But they were out there yelling. But there was another group out there praying. And when she came out that day to have a smoke, it was the praying group that was out there, and they prayed with her. A few weeks later, she quit. And now she runs a ministry to people who work in abortion clinics called And Then There Were None. And she treats them like human beings, and she speaks to herself. If you ever had an opportunity, you know, people ask us, what would you say to yourself when you were 18 years old? That's her ministry. She's speaking to who she was before she saw that abortion. And so she does it with grace and humility and kindness and gentleness. And hundreds of people have left the abortion industry because of her ministry now. And her voice has been given to a movie that's doing well called Unplanned. You know, she grew up Baptist. She's a Catholic now. You know, Norma McCorvey, when she trusted Christ, Flip Benham baptized her in the Dallas pool. He's Baptist. She started out as a Baptist. She died a Catholic. Bernard Nathanson became a Catholic. Why is this happening? I can tell you why. It's shameful when you consider our end of it. The only Protestants they ever see are the ones cursing them. The love they see is all Catholic. First of all, 70% of the pro-life movement is Catholic, so that's not hard to see. But the love they see and are embraced by is almost all Catholic, and they're responding to the love. And I'm going to say this, and some people are going to want to stone me or burn me at the stake. It's the love of Christ that they are witnessing through our Catholic brothers and sisters, to our own shame. So I'm grateful to them for that. All right. They're giving me a light right now. I mentioned books, didn't I? Let me kind of end with this. But here, let me say this. Next week, just so you know, we're We're going to do the Lord's Supper. You're not. I'm not going to pass around the hubcap. Don't worry. But I'm going to have a table up here, and I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 things on this table. And I'm going to talk to you about the upper room and what we know now as either the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or communion, because I was asked to talk about this, and I figure what a better time to do it than on the eve of the upper room. So I'm going to talk to you about what most of the professing church considers a sacrament, one of the two sacraments, baptism in the modern day and what some people call the Eucharist, or what have you. And some people have asked about this in the past. I've done this on a Thursday night. I've never done it on a Sunday. I'll share my thoughts, and I'll share what I see from the Bible. Maybe I should get one of those Blues Brothers cages up here, just in case you all throw something at me. But we're going to do that next week because Easter is upon us, right? The resurrection celebration, the Passover observance. And I want to talk to you about this, and I'll tell you why. This even invades grace circles. And I was in a conversation with about 40 or 50 other grace pastors the other day, and they were talking about this. How do you know if you're out of fellowship with God? In fellowship, out of fellowship. And I just stood back and listened. I thought, I better get the popcorn for this one. This is going to be great. And it didn't disappoint me. Talk about entertaining. Wow. It's a good thing there weren't rocks in the room. But the main argument was, this is how you know you're out of fellowship. If you can't take the Lord's Supper, then you're out of fellowship. And because, Paul says, don't do this, if you have unconfessed sin, you got to go confess to your brother, then come back and do it. And if you do it in the wrong way, there's some harsh stuff going to happen. And so half the room was in a twixt over that idea. But the idea of in fellowship and out of fellowship, I grew up with that stuff in the Baptist church. Are you in fellowship? You're out of fellowship. You in the Lord's will? You're out of the Lord's will. I'm sorry, folks. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life, to have a conversation like that. Do you have a conversation like that about your loving Father? Oh, my brother Nate's back there, and I didn't ask him this morning. I probably should have. Are you in fellowship with Dad today? Are you out of fellowship? This is the stupidity of churchianity, and here's what I mean by it. Let me see if I can help you with this, and then I promise I'll close. Yeah, you don't believe that. Who wrote Anna Karenina? Is it Tolstoy? Tolstoy. You remember the character Levine, right? Or Levin, if you want to say Levin. I say Levine. He comes home one day to his country cottage. You remember this? And his servant sees him and says, the dog comes out, Laska. Laska comes out. I just picked up my dog yesterday, and that's why I'm reminded by this. We were gone for 5 days, and I went and got Bella. Oh, the joy in her life. But Laska comes running to Levin, right? And the servant says to him casually, Laska knows that your spirits are down, that you have low spirits. And in Levine's mind, he was impressed that the servant knew this. He was impressed that the servant could see through him. He was so transparent, she could tell he's depressed. And the dog comes to her master and nuzzles her nose under his hand. And Bella does this to us. And he begins to stroke his dog. And he goes and he sits down, and the dog comes and curls up with her head on her back leg, laying at his feet. And he's watching all this, and she's got complete contentment. She's now in bliss because she's at the feet of her master. This is the genius of Tolstoy, by the way, because he was understood these Christian intimacies. And our relationship is closer to Laska and her master than it is to the nonsense you read by theologians. And no one would say, I wonder if Laska's in fellowship. Is Laska in fellowship or out of fellowship here? This idea that God can't wait to slam the door on you when you sin or when you have doubt. Oh, God's going to slam the door. You've gotten Dad mad again. Now he's going to give you the cold shoulder and not talk to you. You don't get that in Scripture. What you get, you want to know how you're out of fellowship? Are you in a pig pen in a far country? Well, you're pretty far from fellowship there. But it wasn't because Dad kicked you out. And it isn't because Dad doesn't want you at the dinner table. And it isn't because Dad is not, in the heat of the day, on the roof desiring the return of his son. So if you're out of fellowship, it's like C.S. Lewis in A Grief Observed. It's because you've slammed the door and you've bolted it shut from the inside. But we theologians, we like to paint God as that Beethoven's father. He's austere and he's hard to please. Dogs have better sense of their master than most theologians. That wasn't in my notes today. Books. A lot of books written about Jesus. Here's two of them, Unlimited Grace and Born Twice. I'm holding up two of my father's 5 books. Why? Lovely Denise in the tape room, and please thank her and greet her with a holy kiss. Lovely Denise has got them now on Kindle. So you can buy the Kindle versions of these 2 books at Amazon.com. My father has an author page up at Amazon.com right now with just these 2 books on it. You can buy them hard copy or e-copy at Amazon. I would encourage you, if you've read these books and they've meant something to you, to write a short review and give it a few stars. That helps. It helps with the searchability and people finding it and all that. Over the next few weeks, all 5 will be up on Amazon in e-versions. So if you're a Kindle reader like me and you find it easier to share quotes, they'll all 5 be there. Now you're saying, you said 5, there's only 4. Well, that's the good news. The 5th book is coming out in a matter of weeks. There will be a hard copy here for you to buy, and an e-copy you could buy on Amazon, or if you want to buy them on Amazon, you could do that too when they're available. But if you buy them here, I've got a guy who's got an in to the author, and I just might get him to sign for you that day. So he might sign the book for you if you wait for the 5th book. But over the next few weeks, I think the next one coming out, this is actually 3rd in order, and Unlimited Grace was the 1st, but they're not chronological. And the next one to come out is going to be God-Man as an E version. And then we'll have the book signing. I'll let you know a few weeks beforehand, before that happens. Bill, would you like to come up and give a few announcements? Listen, once a month, we're going